Eugene Brewington, we need you to step over here.
Hold on, who are you exactly? Show me some identification.
USPS, the advanced fee scheme, the fake escrow accounts, the $700,000.
This is Eugene Warren Brewington, the founder of 2 Orlando companies built on a single lie: that your timeshare had a buyer waiting. Over $700,000 and hundreds of victims later, the federal government is here to collect.
I'm not talking until I see proper...
Fabricated sales contracts, bank accounts in your name, no buyer funds anywhere in the records.
I don't care what you think you have. You're not following proper procedure. You're not doing this right.
He would not get the chance to explain. Within 72 hours, federal postal inspectors would seize his bank records, his lease files, and every script his callers had ever read. 3 months of operation. More than $500,000 wired in from people who had been desperate to sell. $704,000 by the end of trial. Not a single timeshare ever sold. Not a single buyer ever real. Not a single escrow account that existed anywhere outside the contracts he printed. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever gotten one of those out-of-the-blue phone calls about a property you owned, a timeshare, an extended warranty, anything where the caller seemed to already know everything about you? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you are new here, subscribe. This channel covers the cases that target the people least equipped to fight back, and the people who built their businesses around finding them. Eugene Warren Brewington was born in 1982 in Orlando, Florida. His father drove a delivery route for a regional bakery distributor, working a circuit that ran from Lakeland up through Daytona Beach and back 5 days a week, leaving the house at 4 in the morning and coming home smelling like yeast and diesel. His mother worked the front office at a dental clinic on East Colonial Drive. She answered phones for 9 hours a day. She ran insurance pre-authorizations. She learned to keep her voice steady, no matter who was screaming on the other end of the line about a bill they did not want to pay. Eugene grew up watching her work that phone. He would remember exactly how she sounded when she was getting yelled at, and exactly how she sounded when she was getting her way. The family lived in a 3-bedroom house off Mercy Drive, on a street where every other yard had a basketball hoop, bolted above the garage, and a folding chair at the end of the driveway for whichever neighbor wanted to sit in it. Eugene was the middle child. His older sister was the responsible one, the one who would eventually go on to nursing school in Tallahassee. His younger brother was the athlete, a wide receiver who would play 1 season at Bethune-Cookman before a knee injury ended it. Eugene was, by every account teachers later gave to the federal pre-sentence investigator, the talker. Charming, quick on his feet, the kid who could get out of trouble with a smile and a story before the trouble had finished forming. He went to Evans High School on Silver Star Road. He was not a star student. He was not a poor student either. His report cards described him with words that would, in hindsight, read like a forecast. Personable, engaging in class discussions, easily distracted from coursework, excellent verbal skills, needs to apply those skills to written assignments. He played 1 season of junior varsity football, quit when conditioning got hard, and spent the rest of high school working a part-time job at a kiosk in the Florida Mall on South Orange Blossom Trail, selling prepaid cell phone minutes to walk-up customers for a company that paid him in cash at the end of every Friday shift. That mall job is where the federal pre-sentence investigation report would later trace the beginning of his sales education. He worked the kiosk for 2.5 years. He outsold every other employee his manager ever hired at that location. He was 16 years old when he learned that the difference between a stranger walking past the kiosk and a stranger handing him $40 in cash was almost entirely a function of what he said in the first 8 seconds. The product was not what closed the sale. The script was. The voice was. The eye contact was. He filed that away. After graduation, he enrolled at Valencia Community College, took 2 semesters of general education courses, and stopped attending. He told his mother he was going to start a business. He did not yet know what business. He took a job selling extended warranties for a third-party call center on John Young Parkway, working a cubicle inside a converted strip mall storefront with 30 other dialers. The script was printed on a single sheet of paper. Read it the same way every time. Handle the same 6 objections the same 6 ways. The base pay was $9 an hour against commission. He was good at it. By his second year, he was a floor supervisor, walking the rows in a button-down shirt, coaching new hires through their first cold calls, listening on the supervisor headset, and tapping people on the shoulder when their pitch went flat. He earned a quarterly bonus that paid the down payment on his first car. He moved out of his parents' house and into a one-bedroom apartment in Metro West. He bought a leather sectional and a 50-inch flat-screen television on store credit. He told his sister he was finally a real adult. The warranty call center closed in 2008 when its parent company was investigated for deceptive telemarketing practices in 3 states. Eugene was not personally implicated. He was a floor supervisor, not a principal. But he watched the Federal Trade Commission filing roll through the office, watched the principals walk away with civil penalties and consent decrees and no criminal charges, and he absorbed a lesson that the pre-sentence report would later describe with cold precision. He learned that you could run a phone room that defrauded people across multiple states, and, if you structured it correctly, the consequences would be paperwork. He learned that the people at the top of those companies were not the ones who got prosecuted. The people who got prosecuted, if anyone did, were the dialers. The principal stepped sideways into the next company. He spent the next 2 years drifting through smaller call center jobs in Central Florida, solar leads in Kissimmee, mortgage refinancing in Altamonte Springs, a short stint selling vacation packages out of a windowless second-floor office near the Orange Blossom Trail that turned out to be the front end of a timeshare presentation funnel. That last job was the door he walked through and never walked back out of. To understand what Eugene Warren Brewington built, you have to understand the timeshare resale market as it existed in 2010. A timeshare is a fractional ownership interest in a vacation property, usually a 1-week annual stay at a specific resort, sold with the promise that the owner can vacation there forever, or trade the week into a points-based network of other properties. Developers sold them aggressively throughout the 1990s and 2000s, often through high-pressure sales presentations that began with free dinner, free dolphin show tickets, free rounds of golf, and ended 4 hours later inside a hotel conference room with a closer in a polo shirt asking why the customer was not willing to invest in their family memories. The problem, by 2010, was that the resale market had collapsed. Timeshares are notoriously difficult to sell on the secondary market. Many resorts had right of first refusal clauses that let the developer block any private sale. Many owners owed annual maintenance fees that climbed every year and could not be canceled, even if the unit went unused, even if the owner went broke, even if the owner died. The 2008 financial crisis had crushed any remaining demand. A timeshare that sold for $22,000 in 2006 could not be given away in 2010. There were listings on classified sites where owners offered to pay buyers to take their units off their hands just to escape the next year's maintenance bill. This was the desperation that Eugene Brewington's industry was built on top of. A whole shadow economy of timeshare resale companies had grown up to service it. Some were legitimate, charging modest flat listing fees to advertise units on online marketplaces, and being clear that no buyer was guaranteed. Most were not. The advance fee fraud model was already well established by the time Brewington entered it. The mechanics were simple. A caller would phone a timeshare owner out of the blue and claim to have a buyer ready, willing, and able to purchase their unit. The buyer had already deposited earnest money. The buyer had already signed paperwork. The buyer's funds were sitting in an escrow account. All the owner had to do was pay a small administrative fee, or a closing cost, or a transfer tax to release the transaction. There was no buyer. There was no earnest money. The administrative fee was the entire scheme. By 2010, the Florida Attorney General's office had already issued public warnings about timeshare resale fraud. The state had passed a statute requiring resale companies to disclose certain information. The Better Business Bureau had logged thousands of complaints. The Federal Trade Commission had issued consumer advisories. None of it stopped the calls. Because the targets were geographically scattered, because the dollar amounts per victim were relatively small, because law enforcement at every level was overwhelmed, the calls kept coming. The companies dissolved and reformed under new names. The principals moved their operations from one rented office suite to the next. Florida, with its concentration of timeshare resorts and its forgiving shell company laws, became the national capital of this particular fraud. This was the system Eugene Brewington walked into. He did not invent it. He simply ran it better than most. In late 2010, Eugene Brewington filed paperwork with the Florida Division of Corporations to register two limited liability companies. The first was Timeshare Title Services, LLC. The second was United Clearing Solutions, LLC. He listed himself as the managing member of both. He used a registered agent service in Orlando to handle the official mailings. He opened business bank accounts for each company at two separate banks. He rented two office suites in business parks off the John Young Parkway corridor, one for each company, both within a 15-minute drive of his apartment. The corporate structure was intentional. Two companies, two banks, two physical locations, one principal. If one company drew complaints and had to be shut down, the other could absorb the operation. If one bank account got frozen, funds could be moved. If a regulator started asking questions about timeshare title services, United Clearing Solutions could keep dialing. The redundancy was not an accident. It was a lesson from the 2008 collapse of the warranty call center, applied with patience. He recruited a co-conspirator, Chima Edozie Aligwekwe, 33 years old, also in Orlando, who had access to something Brewington needed: customer lead lists, phone numbers, names, mailing addresses, and resort affiliations of timeshare owners across the United States, sortable by resort brand, by year of original purchase, by approximate age of the owner. Where Aligwekwe got those lists is something the federal investigation would later document in detail. They had been compiled and resold again through the underground market of fraud operations until they reached him. He brought them to the partnership. He managed the team of callers. Brewington managed the money. The callers were hired through Craigslist postings and word-of-mouth referrals. They were paid a base hourly wage of $8 plus a $40 commission on every advance fee collected. They were given a printed script. The script was 3 pages long, single-spaced. It opened the same way every time. "Hi, am I speaking with the owner of the timeshare at the resort? Great. My name is Brandon, and I'm calling from Timeshare Title Services. The reason I'm calling today is that we have a buyer who has already expressed serious interest in your unit and has already placed an earnest money deposit into our escrow account." The script went on for 2 more pages. It addressed the obvious questions. "How did you get my number? You are listed in the resort's owner registry, sir. Who is the buyer? We cannot disclose that information until the contract is signed, for the buyer's privacy and to protect the transaction. How much have they offered? $8,000 above the current resale market rate. What do I need to do? Just pay the administrative closing fee, between $1,800 and $2,500 depending on the unit and the resort. Wire it to our escrow holding account, and we will overnight you the contract for signature." The contract was the heart of the scheme. Brewington had it drafted to look like a real closing document. It had a buyer's name on it, fabricated. It had an offer price. It had an earnest money deposit line that referenced a sum that did not exist. It had escrow account language pulled almost verbatim from genuine real estate transactions. It had a closing date 30 to 45 days out. It had signature lines for both parties and a notary block at the bottom. To a timeshare owner who had been trying for years to unload a unit they no longer wanted, the document looked exactly like salvation. The callers worked from 8 in the morning to 7 at night, Monday through Friday, with a half-hour lunch break and 2 10-minute breaks. They sat at folding tables in the rented office suites, each with a corded phone and a printed lead sheet. They were expected to make a minimum of 90 dials a day. They were expected to close 2 to 3 advance fees a week. Those who could not were replaced inside of a month. Those who could were given longer shifts and better leads. Most of the victims were over 60. Many were in their 70s. A significant number were widowed. They had inherited the timeshare from a deceased spouse, or had purchased it during a happier financial period a decade earlier. They had been listing it on classified sites and resale forums for years with no responses. The cold call from Timeshare Title Services felt, to many of them, like the universe finally answering. A real person on the line, a real buyer with a real name, a real contract in the mail 2 days later, a real wire transfer to send. Within 3 months of the operation going live, over $500,000 had flowed into the 2 business bank accounts Brewington controlled. He moved the funds quickly. Some went to cash withdrawals. Some went to pay the callers and the office rent. Some went to Alaguecwe's personal account. Some went to luxury purchases, including a leased Mercedes E-Class and a new wardrobe, and several large cash deposits Eugene's brother would later be unable to explain to federal investigators. No timeshares were sold, not one. The escrow accounts referenced on every call and in every contract did not exist. The buyers named in the contracts did not exist. The earnest money deposits did not exist. The only money that moved was the money flowing in from the victims and the money flowing out to Brewington, to Alaguecwe, to the callers, and to the leasing companies and landlords who made the operation possible. In late February of 2011, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher named Margaret Holcomb sat at her kitchen table in a small town in western Pennsylvania and tried to figure out where her $1,875 had gone. Margaret and her late husband had purchased their timeshare in 2003. It was a 2-bedroom unit at a resort outside of Branson, Missouri. They had used it 3 times before her husband's diagnosis. After he passed away in 2009, she had not been back. The maintenance fees were $912 a year. She had been trying to sell the unit on a classified site for 18 months with no responses. The call had come in on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller's name was Brandon. He had a buyer. The buyer's name was on the contract he sent her 2 days later by overnight mail. Margaret had read the contract 3 times. It looked, to her eye, exactly like the original purchase paperwork from 2003. It had escrow language. It had a buyer's signature line filled in. It had a closing date set for early March. She had wired $1,875 to the escrow account on the 3rd of February. By the 20th of February, she had not heard anything. The buyer was supposed to have countersigned by then. The closing was supposed to be the following week. She called Brandon. Brandon was unavailable. She called the main line at Timeshare Title Services. The receptionist took her name and number. Nobody called back. On the 28th of February, Margaret Holcomb called her son, who was an attorney in Pittsburgh. Her son called the Florida Attorney General's office. The Florida Attorney General's office took the complaint, logged it, and forwarded it to the office that handled telemarketing fraud, which was already sitting on roughly 40 similar complaints about timeshare title services and United Clearing Solutions filed over the preceding 6 weeks. The complaints had a pattern: same script, same contract template, same escrow language, same Orlando addresses, same wire instructions to the same 2 bank accounts. 40 victims spread across 19 states and the District of Columbia. The pattern was so consistent it read like a template, because it was a template. On the 8th of March, 2011, the case was referred to the United States Postal Inspection Service. The postal inspectors had jurisdiction because the fraudulent contracts had crossed state lines through the United States mail. They opened a federal investigation under file number Orlando-43. 2 days later, the Orange County Sheriff's Office assigned a financial crimes detective to coordinate locally. The United States Secret Service joined the case the following week for the bank records analysis portion of the investigation. The clock that Eugene Brewington did not know was running had now started. He had no idea. Inside his 2 rented office suites, the callers were still dialing. The wire transfers were still arriving. He was, in early March of 2011, at the absolute peak of his operation. He would shut the calling operation down later that month, not because he sensed the federal heat, but because the volume of complaint callbacks from earlier victims was beginning to overwhelm the receptionist and risk spooking the active dialers. He believed he was tidying up. He believed he had timed it perfectly. Stories like this one do not get the coverage they deserve. The victims are scattered across 41 states. The dollar amounts per person look small from the outside. But when you stack them together, you get cases like this one, which the federal government took seriously enough to spend more than 4 years building. If you appreciate this kind of accountability coverage, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We are heading into the investigation now, and the part that comes next is the part Eugene Brewington spent the next 4.5 years convinced was never coming. The postal inspectors did 3 things in the first 60 days of the federal investigation. First, they subpoenaed the bank records for every account associated with Timeshare Title Services LLC and United Clearing Solutions LLC. The records came back inside of 2 weeks. They showed exactly what investigators expected to find and one thing they did not expect. What they expected. Wire transfers from victims in 19 states flowing in. Cash withdrawals at branch counters and ATMs across Orlando. Transfers to a personal account in the name of Eugene Brewington and a separate personal account in the name of Chima Aligwekwe. Payments to a leasing company for a Mercedes E-Class. Payments to 2 commercial landlords. Payments to a payroll service that handled the caller's wages. Payments to a print shop on Vineland Road that had been running the contract templates. What they did not expect. The complete and total absence of any incoming funds that could be characterized as buyer earnest money. There were no escrow deposits. There were no transfers from any third party that could plausibly be a timeshare purchaser. The escrow accounts referenced on every single phone call and in every single fabricated contract were not real. They had never been real. The escrow account number printed on the wire instructions sent to Margaret Holcomb of Pennsylvania was the same account number that received her $1,875. There was no separate buyer side. There were only victim funds flowing in. Second, the inspectors interviewed former callers. Several had quit in late 2010 and early 2011 after realizing what the operation actually was. Some had been fired for low close rates and were angry. All of them, when subpoenaed, talked. They turned over their scripts. They turned over their printed lead sheets. They described the daily quotas, the commission structure, the way Brewington walked the floor and listened on the supervisor headset. They identified Aligwekwe as the person who handed out the lead lists every morning and tallied the closings every afternoon on a whiteboard mounted on the back wall of the second office suite. Third, the inspectors traced the operation through its 2 relocations and executed search warrants on the active office suite, on Brewington's apartment in Metro West, and on Aligwekwe's residence in East Orlando. The warrants were served on a Wednesday morning in late summer of 2012. The callers were already gone. The active office at that point was a suite in a business park off Sand Lake Road. Federal agents seized printed contracts, lead sheets, phone logs, scripts, the whiteboards, and the desktop computers used by Brewington and Aligwekwe. The computers contained the evidence that closed the case. Word documents of contract templates with the buyer name fields left blank to be filled in for each individual victim. Spreadsheets tracking which callers had closed, which fees, and on which days. Email exchanges between Brewington and Aligwekwe discussing which leads to prioritize, which complaints had come in, and how to handle victims who were calling back asking where their money was. One email from Brewington to Aligwekwe, dated February 17, 2011, read in part, "If they call back twice, tell Brandon to take the call and say the buyer pulled out and we are trying to find another one. If they call back 3 times, stop answering. If they get aggressive, tell them they signed an agreement that the fee was non-refundable." Another email from Aligwekwe to Brewington, dated March 2, 2011, read in part, "Pennsylvania lady's son called twice today. He said he is an attorney. We should think about closing the title services line and pushing everything through clearing for the next couple of weeks." The smoking gun was the bank records, and the contracts read side by side. The contracts described escrow deposits. The bank records showed no escrow deposits had ever existed. The same set of documents that promised victims their money was sitting safely in an escrow account at the same time, proved by their absence in the bank records that the escrow accounts were fiction. The fabricated escrow account documentation was the entire scheme. Without it, there was no scheme. With it, there was a federal case. By the spring of 2015, the investigation had identified more than 200 victims across 41 states. The total documented loss was $704,326.55. The grand jury was convened in the Middle District of Florida. On December 2, 2015, a federal indictment came down against Eugene Warren Brewington and Chima Edozie Aligwekwe. Brewington was charged with conspiracy to commit mail fraud and wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1349. He was charged with 4 counts of wire fraud under Section 1343 and 11 counts of mail fraud under Section 1341. 16 federal counts in total. The arrest was made at his apartment in Metro West on the morning of December 8, 2015. It was just before 7 in the morning. Federal agents and a uniformed Orange County Sheriff's deputy approached the apartment door together. Eugene Brewington answered in a white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. He was 33 years old. The operation he had been running had been shut down for nearly 4.5 years by then. He had spent that intervening time working a series of jobs in Central Florida. A few months at a phone store in the Florida Mall. A few months selling cars at a used lot on Orange Blossom Trail. A few months as a dispatcher for a roofing company in Apopka. He had told friends he was rebuilding. He had assumed, by late 2015, that nothing was coming. The federal government had taken too long. Whatever was going to happen would have happened by now. The lead postal inspector identified himself. Eugene Brewington? Yeah, that's me. What's this about? We have a federal warrant for your arrest. Conspiracy to commit mail fraud and wire fraud. 4 counts of wire fraud. 11 counts of mail fraud. We need you to step out of the apartment, sir. Wait. Hold on a second. What are you talking about? What case is this? Timeshare Title Services. United Clearing Solutions. We would like you to step out, sir. There was a long pause. His shoulders dropped. He looked down at his bare feet on the apartment carpet. He looked back at the inspector. That was 5 years ago. Sir, please step out of the apartment. I had nothing to do with how those calls were made. I rented the office. That's it. The callers. Those were Chima's people. He ran the calls. I ran the lease. Sir, step out. You can talk to your attorney about all of that. He did not say anything else after that. He stepped out into the hallway. He let them put him in handcuffs while 2 of his neighbors watched through their peepholes. He was processed at the federal courthouse in downtown Orlando before noon. The deflection he had offered at the door, the suggestion that he had been a mere landlord to the operation, would become his defense at trial. It would not work. The trial began in early June of 2016 in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida, Orlando Division. The presiding judge was Carlos E. Mendoza. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorneys Andrew C. Searle and Kara M. Wick, working under United States Attorney A. Lee Bentley III. Brewington was represented by a federal public defender after his retained counsel withdrew over fee disputes in the second week of pretrial motions. The trial lasted 6 days. The government called 16 witnesses. 5 were former callers who had quit the operation or been fired and were testifying under subpoena. 4 were victims, including Margaret Holcomb of Pennsylvania, who flew to Orlando at her own expense to testify. 3 were postal inspectors. 2 were forensic accountants who walked the jury through the bank records line by line on a courtroom projector. 1 was a former office manager who had handled the printing of the fabricated contracts. The remaining witnesses were representatives from each of the 2 banks that had held the company accounts. The defense was that Brewington was a passive principal, that he had rented offices and signed corporate filings and managed payroll, but had not personally directed the fraudulent calls, that Aligwekwe had run the callers, that the script Brewington could not deny existing was something Aligwekwe had drafted. The jury did not buy it. The emails on Brewington's own computer, his name on every bank account, his signature on every commercial lease, and the direct testimony of 5 former callers who described him walking the floor in his supervisor headset made the passive principal defense untenable. On June 10, 2016, the federal jury returned its verdict. Eugene Warren Brewington, guilty on all 16 counts. Chima Edozie Aligwekwe, guilty on the conspiracy count and 1 count of mail fraud. The sentencing hearings were held on August 25, 2016. Margaret Holcomb traveled back to Orlando to deliver a victim impact statement. She told the court that she had paid her mortgage off in 2010, the year before the call, that the $1,875 she had wired to Timeshare Title Services had come out of the savings she had set aside to replace her late husband's vehicle, and that she had spent the 5 years since waiting to find out whether anyone was ever going to be held accountable. She told the court that the worst part had not been the money. The worst part had been the moment, 2 weeks after she sent the wire, when she sat at her kitchen table and realized there had never been a buyer at all. Judge Carlos E. Mendoza addressed Brewington directly before pronouncing sentence. Mr. Brewington, you ran a sophisticated and deliberate fraud against people who were among the most vulnerable a telephone caller could reach. They were older. They were often widowed. They had been trying for years to escape financial obligations they could no longer afford. You did not stumble into this scheme. You designed it. You incorporated it. You staffed it. You banked the proceeds. The fabricated escrow accounts you referenced on every call were not a small lie. They were the entire mechanism by which you took money from people who trusted you to be telling the truth about something that did not exist. The court takes the position that the deliberate targeting of elderly and grieving victims is an aggravating factor at sentencing, and the court will sentence accordingly. The judge sentenced Eugene Warren Brewington to 9 years in federal prison. He entered a money judgment in the amount of $704,326.55, representing the total proceeds of the fraud. He sentenced Chima Edozie Aligwekwe to a separate 9 years and entered the same money judgment against him. Brewington was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution at Coleman in Sumter County, Florida, a low-security facility about an hour and 20 minutes northwest of Orlando. He was 34 years old when the cell door closed behind him. His projected release date placed him at 43 at earliest. The leased Mercedes had been seized 2 years before trial and sold at auction. The leather sectional and the 50-inch flat screen had been repossessed years earlier when he stopped making the store credit payments. The 2 companies he had registered with the Florida Division of Corporations had been administratively dissolved by the state for failure to file annual reports. The 2 office suites had been released to other tenants within 90 days of the shutdown, one to a tax preparer and one to an insurance broker, neither of whom ever knew what the suite had been used for the year before they moved in. The phantom buyers had never existed. The escrow accounts had never existed. The contracts had described transactions that were never going to close. By the time Eugene Brewington walked out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs on the afternoon of August 25, 2016, the only things in the entire case that had ever been real were the money the victim sent in and the prison time the court sent back. This case was disturbing, but the case on the right-hand side is even more shocking. Click it now.